Sergo, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, and thanks for joining me here on Let's Talk Native. My guest today is Desiree Kane. She's been a previous guest, and Desiree is she's Miwok. She is a multimedia journalist and live media producer. She's one of the founders of Pollination Magazine, and that's also is that a podcast as well?
It is. That is the brainchild and very hard work of a wonderful journalist named Jacqueline Keeler. I just support her strong work.
She's been a guest on my show as well. So Jackie and I go back a ways too. So that's great. And of course, you are also one of the indigenous voices of the Poor People's Movement campaign. And you were involved. It says in your spare time, which that's hard to gauge at in this day. But with missing and murdered Indigenous women through Misty, the Missing Indigenous Sisters Tools Initiative. So you have a lot. You don't run out of things to do, basically.
I mean, does the work ever end, John, really?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, look, even if you don't have multiple fronts you're battling with. I mean, it is so easy to get sucked in to any one of these as a specific wormhole. I've been battling my old high school with over the Native mascot issue, and what happens is every one of these issues you find connect in one way or another back to each other. So what's transpired in Washington D.C., for instance. I mean, when you get one guy who's basically costumed himself, and I'm not even sure what he's supposed to be representing, but it relates back to the mascot issue. When I think about fetishizing Native people, not only does it show up in some place like that, but it also shows up with missing and murdered Indigenous women. So a lot of these issues end up being connected in ways that you don't always anticipate, but you almost have to connect those dots to have the more full conversation. I did a show a month ago or so, and I called it Apples, Pretendians, and Mascots, and part of it is, and I know Jackie, our friend Jackie Keeler, does a lot of work on the Pretendians stuff. I think that might be her. She might have invented that word, as far as I know. I don't know, but and this is part of the problem, because not only do we have these people that show up on our territories that want to try to claim to be adopting our spirituality and being our allies, but we also have people amongst us who are really detached from us as peoples and as cultures, and so it cuts both ways, and I'm not one that wants to try to challenge everybody's ancestry, but when we have this inundation, and look, there's always been, Americans have always had a fascination with Native people. I mean, and as much as we have been victims of genocide and so many other things, there's always this backhanded compliment that comes along with being stigmatized and sometimes murdered or whatever else. I mean, they love parading Sitting Bull and Geronimo out in front of white people, and so there's a strange fascination that white people have with Native people, even as we continue to be victims of assimilation policies, victims of of all kinds of oppression and essentially genocide.
Yeah, and I think that, there is something that is in with the white American psyche, and that's why there's so many family lores around having this vague Native ancestry that's unquantifiable and nobody claims them, and all of the things that Jackie is a boss at talking about and digesting and helping us understand, where claiming vague ancestry is a marker of possession, and it makes you somehow arguably more American if your great whatever the hell raped one of our community members, and then there was a child, and now you're 167,000th of Cherokee princess. There's a lot of this that's going on right now, and especially after Standing Rock. So Alcatraz, there was definitely a quote-unquote born-again Indian type of thing that happened where all these non-Native white people, they got inspired, they wanted to distance themselves from whiteness, and then all of a sudden there's born-again natives, not to mention the sad situation where sometimes adopting relationships from Native people are turned into resource pyramid schemes. It's sad. It's a sad deviation from what some of those ceremonies have been throughout history. So, there's a lot of layers to it. One of the things that Jackie really brought up for me one time that I keep seeing over and over that I think is worth discussing, especially when it comes to allies, accomplices, who's adopted into our families and accepted, socially through kinship systems, is that we're nearing a moment where more adoptees are authoring and getting published than actual Native people.
Oh, and that's real clear, because especially if you look at people who were through no fault of their own, they may have been put up through foster care or adoptions, and so their entire upbringing is not culturally based. And those are some of the most successful authors and producers and filmmakers. And so where does it leave the rest of us? Where does it leave those of us who are living this life, who have lived this life, and not just somebody who just tried to rekindle? And there's nothing wrong with the rekindling. Look, I get all that, but you're right. And so you end up with all these voices that are really not legitimate voices of a Native experience, and that's what we see.
Well, yeah, and I think some of that, there is responsibility for people like you and I, that the American system codes as white Americans, to actually be responsible with the platform when the white people hand it to us. Right? So holding that space and being like, you know what, I'm going to step back, but here's this person, and actually make those spaces for the folks, because we are so privileged in this system.
And of course, then there's for myself, nobody made a space for me.
Right?
Guys like us, we have to make those spaces, because we're not the ones that were going to be offered TED Talks. We're not the ones who are going to be, featured journalists, even on Democracy Now! Or any of these things. I mean, I was a little bit amazed that NewYorkTimes.com, another Native podcaster, mentioned my podcast, because that's the mainstream media isn't somebody who's going to promote a voice like mine, and the same thing.
You're too radical with sovereign perspective, John.
Well, and again, I think I do represent that sovereign perspective, but I don't think anything that I'm saying is that radical or hard to wrap their heads around, and I think that might be more scary yet for some of the mainstream. But I mean, and this does get back. And again, even to the mascot issue, and I know this is another area that Jackie worked a lot on, because what you end up having is these people who want to promote themselves as a legitimate voice to essentially grant permission. And so it's not just, these, it isn't just the fake Native people who are doing this. It's Native people who have found real comfort living amongst the white community, oftentimes feeling special because of that strange relationship that white America has with Native, the fascination, I guess. And so you get some of these voices who are a complete departure from any of the legitimate Native organizations, activists, leaders, nations, that have condemned the use of Native mascots.
Yeah, and then if you try and tell them to knock it off, they layer themselves behind their like super powerful non-Native allies to shout you down, and then the whole thing shut down. It's very real.
Well, and that's kind of what I've experienced is that they again, the non-Native community wants to prop up the voices that say what they want to hear. And, and so all the while they're trying to say they want to honor or respect something, they turn into the most disrespectful and hateful people that you can imagine. Hey, look, I want to go one other area I want to go into, and I've talked about this a couple times on the show, but I'd be interested in hearing your voice on this thing. And I know it is a little controversial because if you question another Native person, even on the mascot issue, sometimes you can be you cross a line for people. And I know there's our people, many of our people have really bought into the hope and prospect of Deborah Haaland being the Interior Secretary, and it concerns me a little bit because, for one thing, we never voted for her. She got elected as a congressperson representing a district, and again, primarily white people were her biggest voter bloc. That's how she got elected. I'm not saying Native people didn't vote for her down there in New Mexico, but so she gets elected in that system. Her background is that she's Christian and she's second generation military. Her father's non-Native, her mother's Native. She became very involved in big D Democrat politics, and finally runs for Congress. And when I hear people say we're finally going to have a voice in a presidential cabinet, I'm thinking, no, we didn't put her there. We didn't elect her. We didn't nominate her. We didn't select her. A white guy did. And there's some motivation that Biden has in trying to promote himself as this inclusive president because of the climate that everybody's living in right now. But I get real concerned because we don't need her for a voice. What we do need is somebody who's got ears, who can hear us, not speak for us. And so and I know that there are friends of ours that have kind of condemned my thoughts on some of this. But give me your general impression. Agree or disagree? Just your general impression about this.
My general impression, two things. One, all we need to know about Biden is that when he was campaigning, he did not really have a Native platform. He had a list of all of the good deeds that he has done for Indian country in the past, but he did not have a specific Native outreach program platform. Native people plugged into his platform, not the other way around. When you look at people like Julian Castro, he came out first and early with a well thought out Native outreach, indigenous sovereignty, land back, the whole thing. But the ears were not there to hear it. And so I think that that's going to say a lot about one Biden. As far as Deb Haaland, I want to be very cognizant to not attack another Native woman because the right wing will run all with it and take it out of context, blah, blah, blah. So what I will say is that there is a super concerning situation where the white people are centering their magnifying glass on Deb Haaland, and they're making New York Times headlines that are saying after 500 years, a Native with power.
Oh, a Native with real power. Yeah. Making it sound like that until a white person, put somebody in that spot, we've never had any leadership.
No leadership, no power, no voice, never mind the hundreds of years of Native resistance on this continent, it's Deb Haaland. And so that's not really her doing, but it is extremely unfair and does not serve our community. So with that, I want to kind of trust her, but and know that there are people we have to have inside, outside, and everyone's a puzzle piece and all of that. I would say I would not choose that path for myself because my views would never serve that. I'm a little bit I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm a Native Two-Spirit. So that really, I think she's got a big fight ahead of her. I think she's got a lot against her. I think it's going to play out exactly how history does. And I have a vote of no confidence that Biden will listen to her, the same way that Obama was supposed to be a good listener and then did not listen to his Native advisor, especially when it came to Standing Rock. And he waited for us to bleed.
Well, I don't know that if Obama listened to his Native advisor. I mean, Jody Gillette, sister to Dave Archambault. I mean, I think he got exactly what he paid for, out of her. I mean, when that administration, which again, Obama-Biden administration, announced they were going to make this historic trip into Indian country, he went to the place that had the most access to the Obama administration of any Native territory on the planet. He went to his senior policy advisor's hometown. I mean, so, and then gives a speech about building something for the children, and that turns out to be the Dakota Access Pipeline. So I never heard Jody Gillette come out strong, in any of this stuff. I never heard Dave Archambault came out very strong. So, and while I agree with you that I'm trying to remain hopeful, as it relates to Deb Haaland, I just think when I started hearing all of our people just say, "Oh, it's great that we have a voice there." We finally, they're almost transferring their power to her because a white guy put her in a position. That I think is really discerning, and again, I don't know if it's a question of whether Biden listens to Deb Haaland. I'm not sure if Deb Haaland is going to be speaking for Deb Haaland or for Native people, because that's not the job that she's put in there for. I mean, the Interior Department, the Interior Secretary isn't set up to be our voice. It's about managing, many things, including Native territories and Native peoples, in a way that, frankly, I reject the whole proposition of being managed in this way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll certainly be interesting, and she will show her colors in time, because this is the first time, I believe, that we've had someone that at least has a lexicon that is appropriate to deal with tribes. So while I am with you in the same boat, I reject the entire premise of being managed as a resource within, the body of the land here. That's not how you deal with human beings.
I mean, there have been Native assistant secretaries, obviously, heading up the BIA, and that's kind of been commonplace. But realizing that she's this is an entire different level, and one of the things that I know, there's a lot of environmental concerns that that she is going to have to deal with. For me, sitting here in Seneca territory, and I come back to what's happened in terms of Native gaming. You've got states, including Democratic states like New York, where the governor is extorting billions of dollars out of Native gaming under the threat that if they don't give them revenue through a revenue sharing program, that they simply won't renew the IGRA mandated compacts that the Interior Department is supposed to oversee, and they failed during the Obama administration, and certainly they failed during the Trump administration. So the Seneca Nation has been hit for $1.5 billion. They've got another $500 million sitting in escrow that the state is trying to lay claims to, with the anticipation they're going to get another $500 million beyond that. That's how much money and that's just New York. I'm not even talking about New Mexico, which has had the same challenge, or Oklahoma, or any of a dozen other states where there are governors trying to squeeze native gaming. And my question is, when somebody first asked me, what's going to be the ask of a new administration? I said, well, how about the Interior Department do its effing job? Because it hasn't, and it didn't do it in 8 years of Obama, 4 years of Trump. Frankly, it didn't do much of their job before Obama either.
But do we want them to do their job, or do we want to encourage people to just divest from the system whole, or help educate people to do that? At what point do we stop trying to reform a system that, is rotten inside?
Well, I mean, the job that I'm talking about in terms of the Interior Department is regulating the states. It's not about regulating us. I mean, so I'm not asking them to manage our business, but the responsibility they have that I'm talking about here is making sure that the states are not extorting money out of. When IGRA got passed, the claim was that they were going to pass IGRA to protect us from organized crime and from overly aggressive states. I don't know about the organized crime thing, but I know we've fallen prey to overly aggressive states, and it's state after state, native territory after native territory. I'm not a big fan of gaming, but I can't not recognize that gaming has become a big part of many native economies. So I've still got to defend it, and I certainly have to defend their right to do it, even if I don't know that it was right to do it.
Yeah, agree.
So, but no, I think I don't know what I want the Interior Secretary to do for me, but I do want them to make sure that the states are not wielding unduly power or illegal power over native territories.
Well, I agree with that. I also agree with all the young native folks and the grandmas and everybody is just screaming land back.
Yep.
Like that's what the ask is. There is a single solitary ask. Everything else, once those things start going in motion, I do believe would fall more into place. Right? So you have native people have more land. Land is power. You can push back on overly aggressive states and be like, no, this is our sovereign territory. You will absolutely not.
Only if that land back it comes with the acknowledgement that we have the authority over that land. And when people say Deb Haaland now will have authority over the head of all federal lands, including tribal lands, that concerns me right out of the gate. We only got a few minutes left, but the one other issue associated with the Interior Department is this new push to streamline federal recognition, and a lot of stuff still gets geared towards trying to turn Hawaiians into a tribe, which the Hawaiians spoke out, and they had hearings all over the islands, and they all spoke in a unified voice and said, oh, hell no, you're not going to turn us into Indians. And yet that's what I'm already hearing some of that out of Biden.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I have faith in the Hawaiian people because they have exhibited for a very long time how to manage their territory. And I do believe in the long run that strength will persevere regardless of any occupation that should fall upon their lands. So if there is someone to fight that, I am really encouraged to hear that it's Hawaiians. Because I know that some of the smaller tribes, we couldn't sustain that as Miwok because it's expensive where we live and we're not insular, but not by choice. It's a different situation. But because it's an island, they have been able to retain so much that makes them so powerful. I'm heartened by that, but also disheartened. I don't have any faith in Biden. I think he's a liberal. He's not progressive. He's not a radical in our favor in any way. So I believe in our warriors in the Native community, and that's pretty much it.
This is John Kane. I've got Desiree Kane. No relationship, or no relation. I guess we're friends, so we have a relationship. No relation. Same last name, just a coincidence. And we'll be right back after this. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native, and my guest is Desiree Kane, who is no relation, who is from she is Miwok, and she's involved in a lot of multimedia. Journalism and publication. She is also one of the founders of Pollination, and we wanted to talk a little bit about. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me with what transpired at the U.S. Capitol a couple of days ago is the attention that the one guy who it's even debatable what he's dressed as, but he's got buffalo horns, he's got fur on his head, he's got a variety of tattoos that symbolize a variety of different things. I've also seen pictures of him with native artifacts. He calls himself a shaman, a QAnon shaman. And one of the first things that happen is some people start sending me pictures. Oh, do you know this guy? And part of it's trying to be funny. I mean, like he's dressed like they're assuming he's dressed as a native. Now, we can argue what he's really dressed as, but he has tried to meld some of this idea of New Age spirituality into into part of his conspiracy theories and part of what he represents, which is clearly along those fascist lines, clearly along those right-wing white supremacy lines, and so it concerns me that that we as Native people somehow get indirectly associated with this guy, and when you consider that, along with the folks that do show up on our territories with some of their New Age bastardized beliefs of what Native spirituality is, we find ourselves inundated with some of this stuff. So, and that's kind of what we wanted to talk about. And I guess, I mean, what is your first response when somebody asks you about this guy in particular?
I also had to laugh, especially at the spicy memes that came out of Indian country where folks are like, he's not my uncle. I don't, or they put the jeans on his forehead.
He dances with Karens. I saw that one too, as the Dances with Wolves,
I appreciated that, but then I also, was like, oh no, people are going to think that this dude is like, he's not with us. I don't know how to say it. And it really started to get complicated, I guess, in certain social circles because he's virtually indistinguishable from many of the white allies in Indian country already. I also think, there's a bunch of white liberals out there running around all like, this isn't who we are, but it is. This is the ethos of America embodied, the type of behavior that we're seeing at the Capitol. So all of this, it's really telling. And when you look at, I'm not even going to say the name of the man that genocided millions of Jewish community members. The way that person, not even human person, the way that thing worked was he infiltrated for many years. He had a failed coup. He worked for many years to co-opt the police force, and specifically the police force, because they are the enforcers of who is allowed in and out of the castle. Right? So in this moment, people are, oh, it's inconceivable how they could possibly breach. It hasn't been breached since whenever the heck. Like, it's because the police let them in as they wanted to back the blue, and the blue was part of the rioting body.
Well, even if you listen to Trump's comments before they marched on the Capitol, I mean, his comments that led all the way up to it, not only his Twitter stuff, but his speech at his own rally, he said, we're going to march on the Capitol. And but he always, bookended it with, but treat the police fairly. Be nice to the police. Respect the police. So it's almost like you're saying, yeah, we're going to go down there, but let's be clear. The enemy is in the Capitol. The enemy is not the ones at the gate. And so that even gives some indication that there was more than just a nod and a wink that had been worked out between the White House and the police presence there. So, and I'm not saying that every cop was, had bought into this, because it does appear that some, tried to resist at some level. But There's clear video that of gate, barricades being moved. I mean, selfies being posed for, and look, you don't have to be a military genius to figure out that if a crowd is overrunning you, you back up, you retreat, and you try to reform your line. You don't just drop your hands and say, "Okay, go by me then." I mean, and that's exactly. I mean, these guys are all former military and everything else. They knew what they were supposed to do. They just didn't do it.
I mean, it's strategic inaction, right? And that is an action in and of itself.
Sure.
But I think it's important for people within Indian country to understand. So everyone's talking about this thing, QAnon. What is QAnon? How does it tie into Save the Children? And what does the capital have to do with Indian country? They are inextricably tied. And while this is not our fight, this is settler infighting right now.
Mm-hmm.
Temper tantrum, settler temper tantrum.
White on white crime, I might add. White on white crime.
Yeah, white on white crime, bunch of thugs,
There's a lot of this stuff that really comes down to, just plain old white supremacy and people trying to figure out how they, whatever means. And I agree with some of this concept of role playing. I mean, obviously this nut with the buffalo horns and the fur on his head. I don't believe they believe that stuff. In fact, I don't think Trump believes the things that he says either. And I think many of the people on the right, they know that they're. I mean, look, anybody who says that they were, that they're concerned about pedophilia, and they're concentrating on a pizza joint in Washington rather than what's been happening in churches, in various denominations for a couple hundred years. I mean, it just demonstrates. This isn't hypocrisy, in the truest sense, where somebody says one thing and does another. They know what they're saying is wrong, and so I find this a little bit more difficult, harder to. I don't think it's that easy to wrap your head around, a uniform belief system that creates some of this stuff. I'm not, you just spun off a bunch of stuff that frankly I have no idea about, but as a Native person who's been, and I'm in my 60s now, and I've been on the front lines of Native issues for a long time. I've never been that concerned about somebody's religious ideologies as much as I'm concerned about their racial supremacy and how that's played out historically, how it's played out today in the United States, and how it plays out in terms of how we are attempting to secure our future. So, and now to get specifically to this guy who's now earned all of this attention in Washington D.C.
God.
I mean, the guy is just a fraud. I mean, and when I see some of these things and I hear some, look, you can hear people who speak are pretty impassioned and they've been, and I agree, some people have been radicalized by some of Trump's lies, but I think there's still a whole lot of people who are just. Who know what they're buying into is wrong and buy into it anyway. Because why? They're trying to justify their own racial bias. They're trying to justify whatever they're claiming is wrong in their lives. And so this guy in particular, and I hate to, I'll throw his name out there because I don't think he's been arrested yet. But he goes by the name of Jake Angeli. He has tried to pass himself off as a QAnon shaman. That's literally what he's called himself. And
Yellowstone wolf.
Yeah, he's got a whole long list of names that he's used, and he is clearly a fraud. And I don't care how many tattoos he's got, or how many costumes he's got, or any of this other stuff. This guy is. I mean, look, he's a failed actor in the first place, and I'm not saying that this is just a character he's trying to develop for film, but he's clearly playing a role here, and I hope it comes and bites him in the ass. But I guess more specifically, as you and I have talked, this guy is emblematic of the kinds of people. This whole idea of mashing up conspiracy theories and this. And this bastardizing of Native culture in what the New Agers call spirituality. So you mash these things together, and then and this is the part that really frustrates me, is some of our people get drawn into this stuff, and they look at these guys as legitimate allies when they really aren't. And I think that is really, kind of the area that concerns me the most, and trying to make our own people aware that we better understand who our allies are and who they aren't. And some of these guys, that are decking themselves out in the proverbial, new age, layers of, of props, whether it's a full costume like this moron wore, or whether it's, some of these guys. And look, this comes from not just from the hippie group. This comes from bikers. This comes from a bunch of different areas. It's not a one unified effort. It's this general, I don't know, flow, I guess, or this general. You see this happening, and it does cross over different segments. So, like I said, it's not just the hippie crowd. It's not just it certainly isn't just liberals, but it crosses over a bunch of different lines. But it's almost always white people. I guess my point is, I mean, and I even question, the not just these cultists, but even some of the what people consider the predominant religions. I wonder how much these people really are faithful. I mean, and that's where when you look at somebody's activity, and I'm not just saying what they do as a group, because what somebody does as a group is not necessarily what somebody demonstrates in their lives in terms of the amount of hypocrisy and that kind of stuff. I mean, you're not going to convince me that nut standing in the Capitol with buffalo horns is somehow a devoted follower of some really well-defined, religious dogma. I just don't see it.
You can. If you watch something like the OAN, which is the QAnon news network, they've got a whole thing. It's much.
Yeah, but do you believe they believe that stuff? It's one. Look, I'm not saying people don't spew out this rhetoric. I mean, listening to half the stuff that Trump says. I mean, I don't believe for a second that he believes the stuff that he actually says. I mean, do you think he? I mean, and I know some people do. Some people think that he really believes he won the election. I think he suffers from a certain level of disbelief that he lost, but that's not the same thing as saying that he doesn't believe he lost. I mean, and so when I hear any of these people who are gonna rely on what they're gonna call their faith or their religious beliefs or their spirituality, when I hear people say I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, that to me is a red flag that I'm already gonna listen to a pretty good line of bullshit.
Yeah, for sure.
So I mean, this is
the average American public member. Think about the failures of the American education system, which I'm preaching to the choir with you and your listeners. Discernment is not something that is taught. So when you have someone in power and you are of the power block, you're a white person, and you have a president that's like, the media is lying to you. And the media is the only way that we have truth dissemination in this moment. You suddenly become prey because you have no discernment to being like, I make enough choices in my life. I can't handle these large, they can't even name it as systemic, so they can't articulate what they're experiencing. They know that they're losing power rapidly. They know that the man in power says that the media is lying and that he's telling them the truth. I have decision overload. My community is dying. I'm alienated from everyone around me. I'm going to hang on to what the man in power says because I'm scared I, too, am losing power.
Well, and I agree with all of that. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that discernment is not taught. I think critical thinking is not taught. I think basic concepts. I mean, it's amazing to me that somebody can go through grade school and high school and even some level of college and still not know how to define or what the definition of racism is. That they can't distinguish the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and racism. They can't even wrap their heads around the whole thing. So when you hear people saying, trying to deny that white privilege exists, I mean, if you're going to deny white privilege exists, then you're clearly going to deny that the white supremacy exists, because that's all part of the same line. So, I agree with you that there are a lot of white people in the United States who feel like they won't admit it, but that they're losing their white privilege, and so they change it around. They won't argue that they're losing their white privilege. They're saying that minorities, native or brown people, are gaining something over them. They want to make themselves the victim. I mean, and it comes down to one thing that never quite gets discussed when we hear all this conversation about democracy. Here's the problem with democracy. It's democracy at its face is majority rule. It means the majority rules over the minority. And you can't promote that as a good thing and then suggest that somehow you need to do something to, how are you going to acknowledge that minorities are mistreated? And when you're trying to promote democracy as this somehow ideal system of governance. And see, here's the problem. The way democracy is supposed to work is that when an issue is put into some sort of public referendum, the minority will concede to the majority. And see, that doesn't exist in the United States. I mean, when somebody loses an election or if their side loses, they don't necessarily concede. I mean, they might give a concession speech, but it's not like they say, okay, well, this is what we have to live with now. I mean, and the divisions right now in the United States between the right and the left between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, right and left is even a little bit, sketchy at some point. But between Democrats and Republicans, and those who will use those parties to, to attempt at having a voice, these divisions are not going away. I mean, they didn't solve anything when the Civil War didn't solve a conflict. It just changed the conflict. I mean, and when we think about the ending of slavery didn't end racism, and a black president didn't end racism. And in fact, if anything, it stoked it. Part of what Trump getting into office is a direct response to the fact that Barack Obama was elected before him, and not like he was a champion for people of color by any means. So, look, this is really coming down to to this idea where white supremacy, white privilege becomes white fragility, and the response that we're seeing out of people today has more to do with their sense of white fragility than anything.
Yeah. I think about the lady in her piano scarf coming out, and she's like, "I just got maced," and they're like, "What? Why?" And she's like, "'Cause it's a revolution." And you're like,
and she's crying because her eyes are burning. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she said it with such and I spent nearly 8 months on the Standing Rock front lines, and I watched this lady and her fragility and honestly, her piano scarf was just the thing that really set me over the edge. I'll be honest, just hideous.
Well, and to be clear, her answer was when they said, "Why did they mace you?" She said, "Because I went inside." She said, "What'd you go inside for?" And that's what she said, because it's a revolution. She said she was taking over they were taking over the Capitol because it's a revolution, in her piano scarf.
Yeah. You can imagine her standing in the morning, and she's like, "Okay, this is the day of the revolution, and this is the scarf. This is it."
Well, just like the guy, who again with the buffalo horns, he thought being stripped down near naked was his best approach to fight a revolution. To not have any protection, he was gonna take his shirt off and just to show off his tattoos, and that was going to protect him.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I mean, if you looked at the stuff that was on his Facebook before he deleted it, he is known as, the QAnon shaman. He thinks he's, a descendant of Odin and some other things, too. So, I don't know why. But
again, do you really think he thinks that? Or do you think that he's found a niche to carve out for himself? I mean, that's where I always come back to this thing when I hear people say, it's like when somebody says, "Oh, Native people believe this." Wait a minute, you're going to tell me what I believe because that's the way you've interpreted a story? I'm not even sure if the Greeks ever believed in Greek mythology. I think they created stories, but anytime I hear somebody says, "Well, somebody believes," Really? You're gonna tell me what somebody else believes? Even if he told me what he believes, I'm not sure I believe it.
Yeah, I mean, you could look into the types of tattoos he has. Like, he's a legit neo-Nazi, this guy.
Oh, I mean, certainly
You know.
that's the role he's playing, right? I mean, getting back to what you were saying. I mean, that's what he's trying to promote himself as. But you also
Yeah.
see he's got pictures of him standing, with native, artifacts and pieces behind him and that kind of stuff. I do want to concentrate a little bit more on how we need to be wary of those people who come amongst us claiming to be our allies. I do want to thank you for joining me. It's great to catch up with you. We'll talk again. Thanks for joining Let's Talk Native.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure.
All right. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. This is John Kane. Yahweh.